Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Siddharth Bhatia. The recent violence in Leicester in Britain has shocked the residents of that city where South Asian communities have lived together for years without trouble. There have been occasional tensions, but never violence. This time round, clashes broke out between Hindu and Muslim groups, which resulted in some aggression and violence. What spurred this sudden outburst? Was it, as some have suggested, the arrival of new migrants, or were the troublemakers from outside Leicester, as has also been said? South Asian diaspora communities in other countries too, such as in Australia, Canada, the US, are seeing some tensions. A little bit of the rise of some kind of aggressive politics in those regions. What is the cause of this? Our guest today is Rohit K. Dasgupta, a lecturer in University of Glasgow, who has done a lot of work on South Asia, including in social change, cultural industries, cinema, queer identities, and in politics. At the same time, he is also a Labour Party politician and is a Labour and Cooperative Party councillor in Newham in London, where he produced the borough's first social integration strategy. As such, he should be able to provide perspective on what happened in Leicester and what's happening in Britain in general. Rohit K. Dasgupta, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you so much, Siddharth, for inviting me to do this today. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation.
Rohit, were you surprised by the sudden outburst of violence? Were you personally surprised? We read here that many local residents felt that it was sudden and they were taken aback.
Definitely, Siddharth. I think for many of us who don't live in Leicester, we were extremely surprised by watching the scale of violence and watching the scale of troubles that broke out. And I think it was quite difficult for us to understand exactly what was happening. And I think, like yourself in India, we were getting all sorts of different reports. So some people told us that it's because of the India-Pakistan cricket match, which flared tensions up. There was, of course, what we've been hearing about, a lot more recent migrants who've moved here from India with RSS sympathies. And at the same time, of course, I think there was some suggestion that a lot of people who were causing this violence was not even from Leicester, but were coming from places like Birmingham, London, and elsewhere. I think for me, I've got friends who live in Leicester. I've got friends who work in Leicester, are also politicians there. And for years, we've seen the communities coexist together, Hindus and Muslims. And at the end of the day, all of us have got a very similar story of immigration in this country, the struggles that we've gone through. And the borough that I currently live in Newham, which is what I also represent as a councillor, has a very similar makeup in some extent. We are one of the most diverse boroughs in the entire country. 70% of our residents are non-white, and almost 40% of them are South Asian, Indian, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So I think it was very, very surprising for us what was happening in Leicester, but more so because for us, it was really important to try and understand what was happening so that we could prevent something similar from happening, in our own homes here.
So, a couple of points that you raised there, which I shall touch upon later, especially the outsiders bit. But in retrospect, looking back, talking to more people, what do you think happened? Why did it happen?
I think it is very difficult, Siddharth, to say that there was one narrative to what happened, and because there's been so many conflicting narratives, I would find it very difficult to say this is definitely what happened. I think what we can say, however, is that there have been tensions simmering for a very long time, and I think what is happening in South Asia and South Asian politics has reared its very ugly communal head in the United Kingdom. And we have seen this, for example, in the 2016 London mayoral election campaign, where we saw the Tory candidate Zach Goldsmith go out very specifically and quote Hindu votes and say, if Sadiq Khan becomes the mayor of London, your gold and jewelry is going to be in trouble. We've seen similar things happen also in a more recent And I must say, that this comes from both sides and from both parties, including mine to some extent, where we have had, by-elections where, all sorts of communal tensions have been used, but, again, for very vote bank politics. And it's quite sad to see the way in which that has impacted what is happening in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, how it has impacted politics over here. And we saw that in, elections, whether it was a 2019 election, where, we've had BJP Friends of India going around this country and telling people not to vote for the Labour Party because the Labour was seen as anti-Hindu. We have seen that in terms of the Tories really making use of that kind of a divisive rhetoric in trying to get votes from us. In even more recently, in May 2022, local elections in London, in places like Harrow, which have got a big Indian community, we've seen that the Labour Party has lost, and has lost very badly. And I think the question becomes, how do we react to that? And the reaction to that is not just, right, let's just do this. This is how we get the votes back. But to actually retrospectively understand that, but at the same time also being true to our values as a kind of a progressive left party. And I definitely think it's all of those cases coming together. I think Leicester is being kind of, that spark, that catalyst that kind of blew things up. Thankfully, and, touch wood, I don't think similar things are happening elsewhere yet. And I think we've had some very robust statements from different local authority leaders, from the Mayor of London, in condemning what's happened and basically promoting, the message of speech and of unity. That, at the end of the day, if we attacked, it's because of our race, it's because of our ethnicity. No one is going to come and ask me, are you of Pakistani origin or Bangladeshi origin? For them, I'm still the P word, regardless of what my background is.
But you mentioned during this answer that while you have to fight it back, Labour must hold on to its values. But a little more than that, the nation must hold on to those values also, which has been about generally a peaceful country where these kind of things don't happen so often. Of course, there are race riots, but Hindu, Muslim, within the Indian community, within the South Asian community, it doesn't. Surely the political and even cultural establishment of Britain, which looked at the Indians and the South Asians as a model minority, surely they must be shaken too.
I think there has definitely been, from different quarters, different kinds of reaction to what has happened. But just to kind of push back a little bit, of course, Siddharth, on the idea of the model minority. And let me just talk about, say, my kind of academic sector, where you've still got so many academics. We all tick the box that we are all ethnic minorities. But if you look at if you kind of see the breakdown, most of us are Indians, most of us are upper caste, most of us are middle class. So I think at the end of the day, I think there is this reckoning that needs to happen, that there are some of us who are in kind of positions of privilege and who are kind of, bandied around as the model minority. And we have seen, for example, other parts of South Asian communities which haven't received so much so this kind of model minority status, and are seen in pretty kind of retrogressive ways, in the ways in which they're kind of the rhetoric around them, whether it's the Pakistani community, whether it's the Bangladeshi community. And I think it's really important for us who do have some privilege to kind of push back a little bit on those. And we have seen in the last few years as well that the Labour Party, again, for example, has always treated us as one monolith. That, of course, they're going to always vote for us. We are pro-immigrants, not that they're always pro-immigrants. But what we have seen, however, in the last 10 years especially, is as allegiances have shifted. Allegiances have shifted a lot. South Asians are not just voting for the Labour Party anymore. The fact that so many of Boris Johnson's cabinet were Asians of East African descent, whether Priti Patel or Rishi Sunak, I think there's something to be said over there. What are the different parties projecting in terms of issues of aspiration? Which parts of the South Asian community are actually going to which side? And I think it's a difficult conversation to be had, but I think it is a conversation we do need to have, because not all of us are the same, and a lot of people are making, are kind of really being quite divisive in how they approach us as a community.
Well, as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, firstly, they have their South Asians, as you said, Rishi Sunak being a good example, but the others too are definitely upper class, privileged people. And you have now a Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who's part Indian, who has said that immigration from India is what is driving all this because they are the worst. They don't assimilate. So, is it because of her general stance against immigration, which is she's following in the footsteps of her predecessor, Priti Patel? Or is it why this specific calling out of Indians as not integrating? And, I wouldn't just dismiss it because I think it is something to be pondered about that this aggression happened. And coincidentally, or maybe not by accident, the perpetrators were Indians from, or one of the perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, were Indians from India.
I mean, in terms of Suella Braverman, she has, I was quite shocked to see in one of her speeches, she said, I have a dream, and my dream is to see one of those detention planes with refugees and immigrants being flown to Rwanda for deportation. And, for a Home Secretary who says that is their dream, I think it tells you a lot about their kind of politics, their very divisive politics. In relation to what you just said about Suella saying about Indians, I have to admit that I haven't actually, I did not read that comment. So that is quite an interesting comment to make. I think, look, it cannot be underestimated that, we have lots of new immigrants who are moving into this country, who are coming with probably in some cases, if you've grown up in India, if you've grown up in Pakistan, if you've grown up in Bangladesh, where you've seen a lot of communal politics play out. And, you are then kind of coming here with some of that mindset and with some of those politics with you. And I think it would be, a lie to say that doesn't happen. Absolutely, it happens. When I speak to some of my friends and fellow colleagues over here in the London Borough of Newham, our mayor is of Pakistani origin. Some of my best friends and fellow councillors who I get along with the most are of Bangladesh origin, are Sikhs, are Hindus, are Muslims. And I think it's really important because we always talk about Canning Town, where I live. This used to be a very white working class area and was also one of the hotbeds of racism, with the British National Party, the National Front having a very large presence over here. And we kind of talk about how, back in the day, and this is, of course, before my time when they were growing up here, in the 80s, 90s, there was so much solidarity. And they always talk about the kind of the shared Black solidarity, of having to come from school, of, kind of going together. You were a very small, tight-knit community. You could not play communal politics in that sense. You were all fighting the same oppressor. And I think that has definitely changed today. And we've seen that there's much more kind of, groups formed, specific religious and national lines. And of course, I'm sure that there is a need for those kinds of politics to thrive because, again, as I said, there are certain privileges that some of us have which get hidden within the kind of the larger moniker of South Asia. And it's like, oh, yeah, we're doing well, but not every one of us are doing well. And so I think, yes, absolutely. I think those kind of self-established groups are extremely needed. But at the same time, I think, yes, there has been a lot more breakdown of it. And I think speaking to a lot of my friends who are second generation or third generation, they definitely see that as something that has been exacerbated in recent years by basically bad faith actors moving into these areas.
Now, this loops me back to your point in the beginning, where you said, and you've said that once or twice later too, that South Asian politics, you mentioned about the campaign against the Labour Party in the elections in London, that South Asian politics has reached the shores of Britain and is being played out in very ugly ways, whether it's in so-called peaceful ways of campaigning or what we saw in Leicester. It's a combination, a confluence of a lot of things. There's social media, there is propaganda within communities, and everyone is reading what's happening in their home countries. India is definitely on top of the list because what's happening here is quite ugly in terms of community relations. Is that specifically being reflected? Because we are concerned more about India here.
Definitely. I think, you're absolutely right there, Siddharth. And just to pick up on one point before I address the wider point that you've made, the role of social media and disinformation was immense in terms of what happened in Leicester. Even the Leicester City Mayor, Sir Peter Soulsby, commented about the disinformation that was being spread through social media in kind of creating hate and that rhetoric of kind of divisiveness. And I think, interestingly enough, we also know that the same kind of tactics are happening in India all the time, whenever there is an election, whenever there is something else happening. And I think it's really important that, we do kind of say that it has played a role, disinformation, sending things out. There's a really interesting and important book that Shakuntala Banerjee and Ram Bhatt have written called Social Media and Hate, where they talk about the role of WhatsApp groups, especially in places like India, where so much vigilantism, so much hate, so much lies is spread all the time. And those kind of things we are seeing happening over here as well through sites like Nextdoor, which are like very hyper local. The context of very hyper-local sites. We've seen that happening on Twitter. We've seen that happening on WhatsApp groups, which we don't even have access to all the time. So that has definitely had an impact in recent years over here. But also, Siddharth, I mean, just to kind of say, India's role in terms of how it has wanted to portray itself as the kind of the democratic, secular, social republic, of course, does not hold true in terms of how we see people are being treated over there. And I think those tensions, absolutely, people over here are seeing. You can't preach something and then in reality be doing something else. And I think it's often a very difficult conversation for us to have. And especially when I'm having those conversations with my Bangladeshi and Pakistani origin friends, where there is so much of unity over here in terms of how we tackle the issues that our residents face. And that's why we are in local politics. We are here to help our residents, whether it is because of the cost of living crisis, whether it's because of the fact that there is so much austerity that's been, pushed onto us by the current national government. But when we see things like what's happening in India, when we see things like the kind of other divisive politics, it plays a role. It absolutely plays a role. And in our conversation, we are always talking about it. And it's like, what's happened to you guys? Something that I get told. And it's very difficult to say, yeah, this is what's happened.
Rohit, I wonder whether you read the statement issued by the Indian High Commission, which specifically said that it condemned or wanted to bring to the notice of the government or whatever that Hindu temples were vandalized. Instead of saying that people of Indian origin or Indian citizens even perhaps, some were victims or stay out of it because it's a country's internal business anyway. Did it startle you knowing that never before has, because it startled a lot of us here because, it has never happened that a foreign mission or Indian mission abroad has said something so specific.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I read that statement, and I know it got a lot of pushback on social media, I think where people said, Indians are not, Indians and Hindus don't just kind of, they're not synonyms for each other. But it was quite, I would say, hurtful in many ways because I have got in my local community lots and lots of Indians of Muslim origin from Gujarat, and I remember we had a conversation with some of them about that statement, and I think a lot of people were very hurt because at the end of the day, they are Indians and they're very proud to be Indians. And to suddenly have a statement where invisibilized, like we've already become the Hindu Rashtra. It was very hurtful. I think it was very, very hurtful to a lot of people over here of the Indian diaspora.
Which actually brings me to one of the points that I was thinking. I mean, Newham, you said, has 70% non-whites, and of which 40% are South Asian. What are they saying to you about, do they talk about just their local issues or personal issues, or do they also talk about, let's say, because knowing you're a professor or you're a teacher and write on India, you're as much of Indian origin? Do they talk to you about what's happening in India or about what's happening within the community in these terms or about Leicester?
I think so. Right after the Leicester troubles, In Newham, our mayor, Ruxana Fias, along with councillors, put out a very strong and positive statement that, in Newham, the borough has been built by the kind of the hard work of British Hindus, British Muslims, British Sikhs, and that we would condemn any attempt to try and divide us or to bring any of those kind of hateful, divisive rhetoric into our borough. We also know that in my neighboring borough of Redbridge, there was a preacher, I've forgotten her name now, who was doing a UK tour and who was supposed to speak. And the leader of the council there, Councillor Jas Atwal, who is of Sikh origin, also made a very strong statement in terms of, we will not allow, hateful people to divide our communities. And if you look, Siddharth, the history of East London it's very interesting. I always say I've got like two homes. One is Kolkata, where I was born, and one is East London, very specifically, where I think I grew up. I moved here when I was 20, and for me, the history, the very radical history of East London is very important. Whether it was so many Jewish activists kind of standing up to the fascists in Cable Street, or what is happening now. In Newham, this is going a long way back, but in the 1980s, there was some very horrendous racist attacks that was being mounted on African, Caribbean, and Asian communities. And there was total police indifference to kind of their plight. And, the community took upon themselves to defend themselves. And we had the very kind of the famous case of the Newham 7, where 7 Asian men were, victimized, and the kind of the formation of the Newham Monitoring Project. I think this was in the 1980s and 1990s. And, they worked to kind of, say that we are one. And let me just tell you, I think a good example of the unity is that, someone like me who is of Hindu origin, if I were to kind of go into those kind of the very basic religious identities, I live in one of the most highest proportion of Muslim areas, and it has never been an issue in terms of electing me, and no one has ever questioned me about that. That is the sort of unity we have. Our assembly member for East London, has one of the highest majorities. He's of again East African Asian heritage, Unmesh Desai. I think for us, it's been really good to see that we have been able to be united, because at the end of the day, our enemies is the same, whether it's austerity politics or whether it is those who seek to divide us. So I think it's very, very sad what happened in Leicester. And I think we are quite determined that we will stop something like that from happening to us over here in East London. We will absolutely do everything to try and stop it. But also in Leicester, we saw some really, really good examples of people from different communities, helping each other and I think, those are the kind of stories that we really need, rather than the kind of very divisive rhetoric that unfortunately some bad faith actors would rather we be talking about.
Okay, putting on your academic hat, why do you think a new kind of aggressiveness is rising in diaspora communities in other parts of the world? In tensions in Australia, where there was an incident of cars owned by Sikhs were torched because they were supporting the farmers' strike. In India, all kinds of preachers from India who openly spread hate, being invited by Hindu groups in the US. Other communities also working out their politics of what's happening in their home communities. Why do you think this is happening?
I think broadly speaking, there has definitely...
An academic answer,
yeah.
if you'll want to look at it that way. I mean, not an academic lecture, but kind of an analysis.
I think that would mean a bit of a spot, Siddharth, but I think broadly speaking, we have seen that there has been a rise of kind of very right-wing reactionary governments everywhere. And I think, okay, so actually, this is not an academic answer, but let me just give you the example of the UK. So we have in the UK a pretty racist and Islamophobic policy called Prevent. Prevent is a way of making, it's how do we prevent basically people from becoming extremists? That's sort of the main thing. And schools, colleges, different kind of government institutions are always told, you need to make a referral when you see people are watching something, doing something, Unfortunately, what we have seen with that particular policy is that almost always the people who get reported are not white extremists, but are almost always Muslims. I was having a conversation with someone the other day about this, and they were like, oh, but the things that's happening in Leicester, it just needs to be, Prevent just need to be told about it. And I'm like, Prevent doesn't understand Hindutva extremism. They just don't. It's one of those things I think we just haven't had a conversation about yet. And people don't see it in any way as extremism. And I think that's a big problem. I think if you cannot confront that there is an issue over here of extremism, how are you going to solve that issue? And that's why we have seen so much hate, the examples that you've just given happening everywhere and people just being totally unprepared for it. And I think that is a big problem. And I think, just from an academic perspective, what we've seen in the last few years, unfortunately, we've seen lots of academics, really respected academics of South Asia, whether it's Christopher Jaffrelot or Philippa Osella and others, who've been even denied entry into India to kind of carry out research, which might not even have to do anything with taking a kind of critical perspective on the government. So I think there is a problem, and I think we need to address it.
Just to clarify, when you said they don't understand the Hindutva extremism, you meant the establishment.
Yeah, correct.
I thought as much. Now, that's just to clarify. No, in fact, that preempts something I was going to ask, and which is that do you think that old model of two or three things, that old model of community leadership, well-meaning multiculturalism, benign neglect, so to speak. We've given them money, they're good people, they're our kind of people, but that's fine, you remain in your worlds. So because most migrant communities, whether they're West Indians or South Asians, have come up by sheer dint of their own hard work rather than any kind of state patronage. That old model, and now this, something happens and you get kind of taken aback, but you have not prepared yourselves, nor have you kept in touch, nor have you understood that these things are happening below the surface. That old model has to break down, and you have to understand that many of these, underneath the rubric of saying wonderful people, we'll go to their temples once a year and pose in a sari, beneath that, there is some really nasty things, menacing things going on.
Oh, 100%. I think, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, unfortunately, community leaders, assert that they're speaking for their entire community. And the problem is, politicians end up listening to them, and that becomes the kind of the homogeneous perspective of the community, and then they kind of decide to make policies and other things based on that, which is extremely difficult. But also within kind of South Asian communities, which are so tightly knit in places like United Kingdom, we've seen some of the kind of horrible impacts of that on politics. So, the kind of the biradri politics that we've seen in certain areas of the UK, which has prevented, certain South Asians from being able to exercise their democratic rights because of those kind of politics. And I think it is very difficult. I think it's almost a two-edged sword in some extent, that if we criticize it, would it be racist? But at the same time, is it time we have that very difficult conversation that, some of those kind of community leaders and elders are being quite regressive in terms of allowing more progressive forms or more radical forms of South Asian politics to take place. But there is a lot of, but you know what, I do feel a lot of promise in terms of a lot more, new South Asian politicians who've kind of come into the fray. And, of course, I'm from the Labour Party, so I'm going to have to mention from my party, people like Nadia Whittam in Nottingham, I think, who is so excellent, and has got a very, very progressive mandate in terms of, she understands the issues in India, and she takes a very kind of a, strong perspective on it. Same with people like Tanmanjin Thesi from Slough, who have been at the forefront of criticizing our own community. And I think that is important, because, I would much rather that we have those difficult conversations than to just kind of try and sweep it all under the carpet.
We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the Wire Talks. Okay, Rohit, your government is already taking a hard line, and has been taking, even under Boris Johnson, a hard line against immigration in general, and now it probably will include immigration from India. Do you think local communities too will now become more hardened? And by that I mean not only the whites but also the old South Asians.
It's very possible. I think I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a wrong path that the government is going down. They've already said that we would much rather not have so many international students, whereas, a large part of our economy depends on international students. And I can tell you that as someone who works in higher education, there are cities and towns where their entire local economy will break down if they don't have international students kind of coming. But of course, at the same time, we've always taken a very rash attitude towards international students, using them as cash cows, getting their money and then asking them to leave. The one good thing that I would say, I can't believe I'm saying this, that came under the last government was the return of the post-study work visa, which was, I think they've got a different name for it now. It used to be called post-study work visa in 2008, 2009 when I was here, which allows students to kind of work for 2 years after they've completed their masters, which I think is an excellent policy. I don't know if that's going to go under this government. I mean, there is skills shortage. We've already, the entire Brexit rhetoric has been anti-immigrant. I just don't know how much further they are going to go with it. I don't think that local communities, Siddharth, are going to be supportive of it, because I think most local communities, so places like Glasgow, places like Winchester where I used to work, places like Loughborough, they have seen the impact that students, immigrants have made on their local economy. And I think it would be very foolhardy. And in the last 2 years of the pandemic lockdown, where you saw that international students were not coming over here, where you didn't have immigration, it devastated some local economies and completely kind of, total breakdown of small and medium enterprises and businesses. So I don't think that local communities will be in any way supportive of it. And I don't think that there is, and we are still waiting for the OBR forecast about some of the decisions that have been taken by this government. But I would imagine that, and I can say this with my hand on heart, that the decision that this government is going to be taking on immigration is ideological rather than at all based on any evidence, because it isn't at all based on evidence.
Speaking of Brexit, Brexit has caused, of course, the war also, but caused impacted the local economy, British economy pretty badly. Now, because of the war, fuel costs are rising, energy bills have gone through the roof. I'm appalled at reading some of the numbers about how people are paying. And I think in the winter, it's going to be even worse. Then in these circumstances, it becomes very easy to blame outsiders.
I actually think it's the opposite. Because I think most people, and if you look at the recent polling where the Conservative government has been trailing behind Labour on an average of 20 points, which would see an outright Labour majority if there was an election called today by almost 100, if not more, that people are seeing through it. I think people are seeing through the lies and kind of mistruths in terms of, trying to scapegoat immigrants as being the problem. Immigrants did not cause the energy fuel price rise. Immigrants did not cause, local economies from breaking down. The NHS is at a breaking point right now because of underfunding, not because of the many, many thousands and thousands of immigrants who are working there as midwives, as doctors, as clerks, as admin roles. So it would be a huge fallacy to say that our public services are failing because of immigrants, but our public services are failing because we have not had proper funding and investment in areas for years. The reason why Brexit happened, and I don't want to go too much into, I think my views on Brexit are very well known that, I thought it was a terrible mistake. But, the reason why white working class communities voted for Brexit was because they never saw investment or the promises of globalization and promises of the EU funding ever reach those areas. They didn't see it. In the same way, we've heard of a lot of South Asians who voted for Brexit on the promise that, if we stop more Eastern, it was very specifically Eastern Europeans, right? If we can stop more Eastern Europeans from coming in, you will be able to get in more people for your curry houses and everything from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. Again, we know that's not happened, even though, some government ministers ministers apparently went around promising people that that's what's going to happen. So I think people are going to see through it, Siddharth. I don't think British people are that naive to believe. Well, one would hope that immigration is the reason for the problems we're facing today.
I wonder if some Leave voters are now feeling regret about what's happened. In the beginning, right in the beginning, you said, you know, thankfully it's peaceful elsewhere. But there have been fears, and I think the local MP in Leicester said something on those lines, if I'm not mistaken, but somebody definitely did. There are fears that what happened in Leicester could spread to Birmingham or Manchester, where a large number of Asians live. What are the chances of that? Do you think that's exaggerated, or do you think that needs to be investigated because you want to preempt something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I won't say that there is absolutely no chance of it happening. I think there's local authorities need to be under vigilance that, are there bad faith actors who are going to try and cause problems between Asian communities again. And I think, a lot falls on people like us as local councillors who are, day to day, have access to our residents, to community groups, and to speak to them and picking up, what kind of tensions is happening, if any. So yes, absolutely, none of us are prone to it happening, but I think for local authorities to be prepared to kind of stop something like this from happening if there are possibilities. I think that's the important thing. I think, again, just giving you the example of Newham, we have put a very positive statement out about our unity, about the kind of the shared history that we've got, about the fact that, our oppression is a shared oppression. And, as we work together, it's a shared struggle, and kind of almost going back to that history of solidarity and solidarity politics, that we don't want that kind of hateful rhetoric coming to our boroughs, basically. So yeah, I think we just have to be under constant vigilance that if the kind of the ugly head of communalism were to rear its head, then, we try and stop it.
Do you think, just on this point, do you think that anyone from, the national government has 100 other things on its plate, but do you think that the national government or even the local law and order, police forces, or, people who are not local councillors are fully cognizant of these things that they have to do to stop it?
Yeah, we have had meetings with our local mosques. We've had meetings with our local temples. And in Newham, we have an interfaith commissioner who works across all the different faith communities. Some of our councillors have got very deep ties with mosques, temples, churches. So there is definitely a lot of work that has already been carried on this. And there is an interfaith forum as well within our borough where some of the religious leaders meet, faith leaders meet from time to time. And if we do kind of find things that could lead to it, I think we are ready. And I know, something slightly different, but I know with Israel Palestine, there was also a big worry how that would impact in a place like us. And again, we work very closely, mosque leaders as well as with Jewish leaders, in kind of trying to see how we can get that message out within our local schools and make sure that, we did not have any of those kind of troubles. So I think it needs a lot of work, but I think, we will do it, and I don't say this as someone who's written a social integration strategy, but it's what we've seen happening.
No. My specific question was, do you think the national government at all has understood that there is something bigger happening in the country? Not in local communities, but I know that they are basically fighting for survival, but still, there must be bureaucracies, there must be policies of old standing policies of looking at immigrants or looking at other communities, ethnic minorities, etc. Do you think there is any? The point is, the BBC did some really fantastic stories, but is there some understanding even that this kind of thing, because I know that MPs tend to appeal to their constituents But if it's going to become another cynical political exercise, then I'm afraid your well-meaning efforts won't last very long.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I actually
I'm sorry to be sitting so far away and giving you these lectures, but my point
no,
is
no,
that
yeah.
we've seen how things spread. It's a different soil, I understand, but we've seen.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's very difficult. I think something like that would have to be brought up by. Look, Labour is in opposition. There's very little in terms of power that Labour has in making any meaningful change. But when you have a Home Secretary like Suella Braverman say things like, "Oh, we need to stop the drive towards multicultural Britain because multicultural Britain is bad," you know that there is a problem when you've got a government who's kind of making that their kind of platform, which is such a huge and I am the last, but I'm not a Blairite at all, but it's such a move away from the kind of multicultural Britain and so on rhetoric of the kind of the new Labour government. But yeah, it is a problem, and I think unless MPs bring it up and say that this is an issue and we need to know how to deal with it, I don't know what's going to happen. There is, you must have heard the term that's going around at the moment, that there's a culture war going on over here, right? The kind of anti woke politics, and kind of this government is very much against woke politics because identity politics has taken things too far. We are too much appeasing LGBT people, too much appeasing trans activists. We are too much appeasing Black Lives Matter activists, and it's hateful and it's divisive. And those kind of culture wars seeps in. And we've seen that. There was a report that came out just yesterday, which showed that hate crime has risen almost 45 to 50% in some categories. And I think that just kind of speaks to, divisive rhetoric is going to have an impact, and it impacts all of us. And we saw that after Brexit. I still remember, Siddharth. I mean, one of the reasons I joined politics was just the day of the referendum in 2016. I remember coming back from Winchester, which is where I used to work, and I had a kind of Labour in sticker that we were wanting to stay in. And I remember kind of 2 days in a row, once I was walking back from there to the station and me being told, "We voted you guys you guys out, what the F are you still doing here?" And the second time, on the train back, where someone actually pointed at my sticker and was like, "What, we are getting rid of you very soon, da, 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 da." And I have, by that time, I had lived here for several years. And of course, there was implicit racism. No one is going to deny it. But that kind of overt racism, you never saw. And you could see, the hate that was unleashed because of the kind of very divisive rhetoric that our media and so on was playing out, our politicians were playing out. And it of course has an impact. And we are seeing that happen now, when it comes to race, when it comes to sexuality, because of some of the kind of really hateful culture wars that's being played out by the government, aided and abetted by some parts of the media.
Well, you've summed it up very nicely, the culture wars. I'll discuss woke politics with you one day separately because I'm by no means a conservative party type, but still. On that note, we've got to end this. But Rohit, thanks for putting a lot of things into perspective for us sitting thousands of miles away. I must confess, people here too were startled at what happened. But there is a kind of implicit sense that it had to happen because it was inevitable that what's happening here would be reflected elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for participating in this. That was Rohit K. Dasgupta, a lecturer, an academic, as well as a politician who kept on changing hats very rapidly, but got the point across about explaining to us in fairly stark terms what happened in Leicester and what's happening in Britain. I hope my conversations are keeping you updated on what's happening in India and the rest of the world. Along with The Wire, where you can listen to my show, you can also listen to it on IVM Networks, Audible, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Wink Music, Spotify, and Listen Notes. A wide spectrum of platforms where the Wire Talks plays every week. With this, we come to an end of this podcast. We'll be back next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM Podcasts website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Siddharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.